Une découverte étonnante. 62 ans après la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, 13 cadavres de soldats allemands ont été retrouvés puis exhumés. Ça se passe dans un bois de Villeneuve-Loubet. Explication Vincent Yagui.
Les squelettes reposent ici, juste à 1 mètre de profondeur. Une fouille méticuleuse pour faire ressortir de terre l'histoire de la guerre 39-45.
Bon, là c'est un crâne qu'on a trouvé ce matin encore à l'intérieur du casque allemand, vous voyez. Donc le crâne il est abîmé malheureusement, mais bon on reconnaît encore. Il y a même encore une petite mèche de cheveux du soldat, vous voyez.
L'histoire est ressortie de terre grâce à ce jeune étudiant. C'est lui qui a localisé la fosse après une longue enquête auprès des habitants du village.
Les habitants étaient tous plus ou moins au courant, mais par contre personne ne savait exactement où c'était, ni si ça avait pas été déjà exhumé il y a 50 ans, quoi, voilà.
Tout un village au courant, mais personne n'ose dévoiler l'affaire jusqu'à aujourd'hui.
C'est pas un secret de polichinelle, disons qu'à la Libération, il y a eu plusieurs morts allemands.
Alors les habitants, ils les ont mis sur des charrettes, ils ont creusé un trou, ils les ont enterrés ici, bon tous mélangés.
Je me souviens bien sûr de la tranchée ouverte, de la terre qui avait été remuée.
Aujourd'hui, il ne reste plus que les casques, des munitions, des gourdes, mais surtout les plaques des soldats avec leurs matricules.
À travers ça, effectivement, on va pouvoir mettre une identité précise dessus.
Les plaques seront envoyées à Berlin, puis restituées aux familles. Les corps exhumés restent en France. Ils seront inhumés le 23 juin prochain au cimetière militaire allemand de Berneuil, dans les Charentes-Maritimes.
In this video, I'm going to show you all the conclusions of the investigation that I did in this mass grave of German soldiers in my hometown of Villeneuve-Loubet. So first, a little bit of history. Villeneuve-Loubet is near Nice in southern France. And so when the Allies invaded southern France on August 15th, 1944, a few days later the first troops reached Villeneuve-Loubet, and they were members of the very famous 1st Special Service Force, which was a sort of commando unit consisting of both Canadian and American soldiers. And when they approached Villeneuve-Loubet, the Germans were waiting for them in ambush, and they shelled them and mortared them and inflicted quite a few casualties. But these commandos, they were, they had been in the war in Italy, they knew what to do. So they just sat back for 24 hours, and the next night, on the night of August 25th to 26th, 1944, they just went around the German positions during the night, went up into the castle that's on the top of Villeneuve-Loubet, that for some reason the Germans had not occupied. And when the Germans woke up, well, that was it. The commandos were behind them, and all they could do was surrender or get killed, which was what happened to quite a few of them actually. And then during the afternoon of that same day, the Germans tried to counterattack, and they failed, of course. And you see the period report here says that they estimate that 50 Germans were killed in the Villeneuve-Loubet sector. And these forcemen, they took a few pictures, souvenir pictures with one of the killed Germans. This is a picture that was sent to me by one of the veterans of the unit. And what's really interesting is you can see that these guys are posing with the dead German like you would pose nowadays with Mickey Mouse if you go to Disneyland. Like 2 different guys are posing with the same body. And if you look at this picture from close up, you can see that there's a kind of characteristic hill in the background here. And if you go to the same place today, of course, well, you can still recognize the same hill here in the background. Now, I was doing this research about the war in 2006. And I was going to speak to old people on the benches in the village, and they would literally be saying, like, what are you doing? Are you looking for the Germans? And I was like, yeah, actually, I am. And what it turned out, what the old people said is that all the Germans who had been killed in this battle in Villeneuve-Loubet, they had all been buried in a little forest near a creek. And as far as everybody knew, nobody had gone to look for them, so they were still buried there. And this is the exact place where the Germans were buried. And I was able to locate the exact place because I found one old man who was already more than 90 years old, and he had been working in the field in 1944, and he told me the German grave is like exactly between a certain tree and the river. So then I warned the German War Graves Commission, the Volksbund, and they came over and they organized an exhumation so everything was legal. And I found a bunch of medical students, friends of mine, who were willing to help. And so in 2006 we exhumed this grave of German soldiers, and we found that it contained a total of 14 bodies. Now we're not going to go over each body in this video, we're just going to go over the more interesting bodies. So body number 1, you can see him being dug up here, and you can just make out an ID tag here where the arrow is sticking out from under his chest. And this ID tag is ultra interesting because not only does it give you the guy's identity, it also gives you his cause of death in this case, because you can see that a bullet went literally right through the middle of the dog tag like you could expect to see in a movie. And it turned out the guy was called Franz Gnielczyk. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that properly. He was 23 years old. He was in the 7th Company of German Reserve Grenadier Bataillon 372. And he came from an area called Silesia, which is in Poland nowadays, but that had been annexed by the Germans during the war. And another interesting thing on his body, we saw his femur, so on one of his thighs, he had this bone callus visible that I'm pointing to. And that shows that this guy had broken his femur in the years preceding his death, and then that it had healed. And by doing a bunch of research, I was able to find this soldier's half-sister still alive in Poland. So she sent me a few pictures of him. And she also explained that he had been a miner working in the coal mines of Silesia. And in 1943, before being drafted into the army, he had had an accident in the mine and he had broken one of his legs. So that's always good when you find something that matches the guy's identity, not just his ID tag, but you see that he also has a similar wound that he's supposed to be known as having. And the half-sister also had a picture of her brother in southern France. This is him with the white square around it. And you can see that it's nice and warm and there's like cactuses in the background. So this is in southern France. Body number 2, unfortunately, he had no ID tag, but I'm going to mention him anyways because, see, we dug him up and we found all the major bones and none of them were broken. We didn't find any trauma, any gunshots or anything. But if you look at the equipment found on him, he has this canteen with the shrapnel gash. He had these bullets in his ammunition pouch that also have shrapnel gashes. So even if there's no wounds on the bone, you can conclude he was probably killed by shrapnel fragments. Probably some kind of flesh wound or maybe a chest wound that we didn't manage to see because the ribs were so damaged when we dug up the bodies. Then body number 4. He's hard to see on the picture here, but basically his head was completely smashed into tiny pieces. Near the head there was a helmet buried, this helmet here that you can see. And on his chest area there was a dog tag that identified him as being called Otto Mertin, 22 years old, also in the 7th Company of Battalion 372, and also from Silesia in Poland. So I took all the fragments of the skull and glued them all back together. And you can see his helmet has this huge shrapnel hole in the front of it. And if you look at the picture of his skull seen from on top, or the drawing I made from the side, you can see that he has a wound on his head that matches the helmet. And for interest's sake here, this is a picture showing a German 88mm shell. And one shell like this made all these fragments, so hundreds of fragments, and pretty much any fragment could just go through a helmet like this and kill somebody. So that gives you an impression of how potent these shells were. So for this guy, I also looked for his family, and I was also lucky. I managed to find his sister and his twin brother who were still alive. So it turned out that these were 2 twin brothers. Both of them had been working as miners, just like body number 1. They'd also been local volunteers in their fire department. And then one brother was killed during the war and the other one had the luck to survive. And of course they were happy to hear that their brother had been found. And this picture is quite interesting because you can see his face in 1942 and then in 1944. And you can see how it looks like he's 10 years older. And actually, even in the second picture, he's only 22 years old. And body number 1 had a picture of him in southern France. And then this body number 4, Otto Mertin, he's also on the same picture. And that actually makes perfect sense because both guys were in the same company. Now body number 5, we found him with multiple wounds of his legs. Both legs were smashed, as you can see on these pictures or on this drawing. He also still had his helmet on his head that had 2 large shrapnel holes in the back, so it seemed pretty clear he had been killed by shrapnel fragments. And he also still had his ID tag that identified him as being Franz Guda, 34 years old. Also from the 7th Company, like the other guys. And he was the only guy who was not a private. This guy was actually a corporal. And you can see on the period pictures of him, he has a pistol holster that we found when we excavated his body. He also had some badges, including this black wound badge that we also found on his body. So once again, just like for body number 1, the items we found with the body seem to confirm the identity that's given by the dog tag. And I looked him up again, like the other ones, and I found his son and his daughter still alive in Germany. And they had kept the letter they had received in 1944 explaining the cause of death. And it says, your husband was killed by a direct hit by a grenade, a Granate Volltreffer, in Villeneuve-Loubet. And that corresponds to what we found on the body with all those multiple wounds in the leg and head. Body number 6, he was found with a shrapnel hole in his helmet. There was also a shrapnel fragment where his stomach would have been. And he still had his identification tag, which had these numbers on them, 10,000 and something of Grenadier Battalion 46. And unfortunately, the German archives said we cannot identify this guy, that we don't find any match for this guy's identification tag, so the body remained unidentified, at least at first, and we'll speak about him again in a few minutes. Body number 7, he had this wallet with him, and it was all hardened, so we didn't even try to open it, but we made an x-ray, and you can see it contains a crucifix, and then several little religious medallions. Body number 8, he had his identification tag with him, and he was identified as Otto Vorberger, 19 years old, of the 5th Company of Battalion 372, so not the exact same company, but the same battalion. And he was from Sudetenland, which was part of Czech Republic that had been annexed by Germany. And in between bodies 7 and 8, we found this spent .30 caliber US bullet. So we're not sure which of the 2 bodies it killed, but it must have killed one of them anyways. And it makes another guy who was killed by a gunshot wound and not by shrapnel, by artillery. Body number 10, he had his ID tag, and he was identified as Hubert Pilsch from the 7th Company of Reserve Battalion 372, also from Silesia, Poland, and he was killed the day before his 18th birthday. He would have turned 18 years old just the very next day, August 27th, 1944. Body 13, he had no dog tag unfortunately, but when we exhumed his skull, you can see this is a skull, it had this fracture going all around it, and this is where the face would have been here, around the front here. And this fracture gives the impression that there must have been some kind of facial trauma to cause this fracture going all around. And if you look at that period picture taken by the Allied soldiers, you can see this guy seems to have a wound here in the area of his temple. And of all the bodies found in the grave, of all 14 bodies, body 13 is the only one who has a wound that seems to maybe match the wound visible on the period picture here. And the last body, body 14, its skull was completely smashed, as you can see here. And near the skull we found this helmet buried with a bullet hole coming in the back. And the only body that could match the helmet was this body number 14, so we concluded that he was killed by a gunshot wound in the back of the head. And he was not, he had no identification tag as well. Now, a few interesting comments. We saw lots of signs of pilfering on these bodies, see? Only one body still had his shoes. Several bodies still had the bayonet sheath on their belts, but they had no more bayonets inside. Most of the ammunition pouches we found had been emptied. And then this is the best illustration. It's a belt, you see, and you can see it's been cut in half with something sharp. And we found both halves of the belt thrown into the grave, at different parts of the grave. So somebody just before burying the bodies said, I'm going to cut this guy's belt off to take his ammunition pouches and stuff, and then he threw away the pieces of the belt. A few other interesting comments. See, since these guys were soldiers, they had lots of equipment on them, and you can see the equipment can be very useful for quickly understanding the cause of death. Like lots of helmets had these shrapnel holes or bullet holes. And when you find a shrapnel damaged skull, it might take you a half a day or a whole day to glue it all back together. Whereas when you look at the skull, you immediately understand what caused the death, what direction it was coming from, the trajectory, and all that. What do we notice with all these ID tags? Out of the 14 bodies that we found, only 5 could be identified with their ID tags. See, 7 bodies had no ID tags at all. 1 ID tag could not be read because it was completely corroded. And 1 ID tag, the one of body number 6, couldn't be decoded. So what should there be on a logically made ID tag? You're going to think like it should have a name, it should have maybe a serial number, maybe a guy's hometown, name of next of kin, things like that. And what did German ID tags have on them? Well, none of that, right? if we take a look here. There's just a bunch of numbers. And for comparison, here's a World War II US dog tag, and you can see it has a person's name, the name of the next of kin, his address. This is a World War II Italian dog tag. You can see that it has also a name, also the hometown, name of the next of kin, a year of birth, a serial number. The US one also has a serial number, of course. So let's go back to these German dog tags. What did they have on them? They actually had a unit name, the unit that the soldier had done his basic training in, and then a number. So when guys went to do their basic training, they were all given these consecutive ID tags, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with this number on it. And the problem is that it doesn't have anything that's recognizable by the soldier, such as his name, and there's also no redundant information at all on the tag. So if the tag is damaged and just a bit of the information becomes unreadable, well then the tag just becomes useless. So these German ID tags, they all correspond to a unit, and to be decoded, well, that unit's, let's say, list of names still has to exist, and if that list of names got lost during the war, then the ID tag will become useless. And since it has since the tags have no identifiable information on them, like a name, soldiers could easily mix them up as well. And if a single number becomes unreadable, well, then the tag usually becomes useless. And here are some actual examples of that from southern France. You can see that these two soldiers were exhumed with their ID tags, and in both cases it says the ID tag lists are missing, so this guy cannot be identified. And then here you have an example of a tag getting mixed up. Here a body was exhumed with a full identification tag, and it says the owner of this tag is still alive, so this body will therefore remain unidentified. So this guy probably mixed up his tag with another soldier, and then he was buried with another soldier's tag. And here are some other examples. This is a German dog tag. You can see that on the top half the number ends with a 1. On the bottom half they forgot the number 1. And just that one little mistake would be enough to make this tag probably be completely unusable, because one single number missing could then correspond to so many different combinations that it would be next to impossible to find out who the tag belonged to. Whereas here on this US dog tag, this soldier was called Barto, and they made a mistake in his name. They put a T instead of an O, an O instead of a T. And that mistake has no consequence at all. You could still find the guy in an alphabetical list. He still has his serial number, so you could still find him without any issues. And a similar story for the Italian dog tag. This guy was called Got, according to the tag. And then when you look him up, you see his name was actually Bot, so with a B instead of the G. But even that mistake literally has no consequence, because the guy still has his serial number, so you can look him up. You still have his hometown, his parents' name. So even if the military archives were destroyed, you could still go to his hometown and do research and then find him. And this is another even more extreme example. This is just half an Italian tag, and the soldier's name isn't even written on it. But because it has his mother's name and his village name on the bottom half, you can very easily research him. That's exactly what I did, and I was able to find out who he was with just a minimal amount of research. Now let's go back to this body number 6 found in Villeneuve-Loubet. He had this ID tag with these numbers, 10,000 and something, of Grenadier Bataillon 46. And the German archives said, we cannot decode this tag, so the body has to remain unknown. I was not satisfied by this response at all, of course. And so what I did, I made a list of all the Germans killed in the Nice area. And I decided to see, does this Grenadier Battalion number 46 at least even exist? And when you look at the list I made, you can see that there was a Pioneer Battalion 46. You can see that there's no Grenadier Battalion 46, but then you can see that there's a Grenadier Battalion 461, and the numbers for those dog tags are all very high, in the 12,000. It's kind of like the one that we found that had 10,000, in the 10,000 range. So I just told Berlin, like the archives, please look this guy up again, but look him up for Battalion 461 instead of 46. And then sure enough they replied, oh yeah, now we find him. He was a 19-year-old guy from Silesia in Poland. His name was Józef Krzyzowski, and he was in the anti-tank company of Regiment 239. So Regiment 239 was the regiment that the Battalion 372 was in, just like all the other soldiers. So all the guys are from the same regiment. And as you can see, I said before, a single number becoming unreadable was enough to prevent these German dog tags from being decoded, and this illustrates it very well. This guy actually, his dog tag almost was not decoded because of one single number missing. Now, that makes a total of 6 bodies identified thanks to the ID tags, and then the Germans looked in their archives and they found that they had 2 soldiers known to have been killed in Villeneuve-Loubet in August 1944. One of them was Josef Fox, aged 17, from Silesia, Poland, and the other one was Josef Lössl, aged 35, from Sudetenland, so in Czech Republic. And they decided to consider these 2 guys identified, even though we didn't actually find any physical evidence of the soldiers having been in the grave. We didn't find any dog tags or rings or anything like that for these soldiers. But anyway, so they considered them identified. That made a total of 8. And this brings another interesting question. What do you think is the validity of identifying people even though you don't have any physical evidence that they were in the grave? This question was answered in a very graphic way when shortly after me finding the grave, a local historian in a small village in Germany contacted me, and he said, "Oh, well, you know, somebody from my hometown, Fretter-Pico, was killed in Villeneuve-Loubet, and he was in the 7th Company, and can you please tell me, is he one of the identified bodies?" So I was happy to receive this request, because I figured maybe he'll be a 9th body that we can identify. And the village historian sent me this period document that he had, and you can see it says, so this soldier, Alois Vuhr, he was killed in Villeneuve-Loubet on August 26, 1944. So the information looked pretty solid. And for some reason I just looked the guy up on Google. And this is Alois Vuhr, so who was killed in Villeneuve-Loubet. And when I wrote his name on Google, this picture came up. And his face looks pretty similar. And then, so what is this picture? This is a picture taken by the US Signal Corps, the US Army Signal Corps. So an official army picture. And the picture was taken in New Jersey in September 1944 when a bunch of German prisoners were getting off a prisoner of war boat. And what the picture says is, this is Grenadier Alois Vuhr from Fretter-Pico. Alois Vuhr was captured in southern France by Americans near Nice on 27 August 1944. So here we have Alois Vuhr from Fretter-Pico, who was killed in Villeneuve-Loubet near Nice on August 26th. And here we have Alois Vuhr from Fretter-Pico, who was captured near Nice on August 27th. So this is another one of those mistakes in identity, obviously. I was able to track Alois Vuhr's son down, and he told me, like, what happened is that Alois Vuhr was in Villeneuve-Loubet, and a friend of his was wounded, and so he picked his friend up and carried him away. And just after that happened, apparently everybody else was killed, so that's why he survived. And for some reason, the other Germans thought he was dead, so they sent a letter to his family saying he had been killed. And this is his actual real obituary from the 1980s, when he really died, so 40 years later. And it says his grandmother was very shocked when news of his death in France came in 1944. They had a memorial service in his village, and his name was carved on the cenotaph. And then later it turned out that it was a false report, and Alois Vuhr was actually a prisoner of war of the Americans. And let's go back. Remember, body number 1 had this picture of him taken in southern France. And we saw body number 4 on the same picture. And Alois Vuhr was actually also on this picture, apparently. Anyway, his son said that sure looks like him. And Alois Vuhr also had a picture that his family sent me, this picture here on the right. And if you compare all the faces between the 2 pictures, keep in mind both pictures show men of the same exact company, it seems like a bunch of the guys can actually be recognized, see? So what were the reactions of the families to this recovery of the bodies? Well, the son of body number 5, Franz Guda, he came to Villeneuve-Loubet as soon as he could. He wanted to see where his father had been killed. And then the families of bodies number 1 and bodies number 4, they had articles published in the local newspapers in Poland. So you can see that all this was very important for the families, even though it was 60 years after their relatives had been killed. And let's get to the conclusion now. So a total of 8 bodies were officially considered identified from the Villeneuve-Loubet mass grave. So two of them were identified just from archival information, and then 6, their ID tags were actually found in the grave. I was able to contact 5 families of the soldiers, And of the 8 identified bodies, 6 of them came from Silesia, 2 of them came from Sudetenland. Actually, not a single one of them came from within the current borders of Germany. And all the soldiers were from the same regiment. 6 of them were from the very same company. So you can see that the German units were very well organized, even though they were in the middle of the chaos of the Allied invasion. And they were so well organized that the German army even knew the causes of death of some of these soldiers and contacted their families and told them how they had been killed. And sometimes people wonder what the usefulness of exhuming a World War II grave is. Well, the first obvious use is that there's still family members alive, and for them it's very important to know what happened, especially if it's children, it's very important for them to know where their father is buried, how he was killed, because sometimes they imagine scenarios that maybe he, was a prisoner and then stayed in America or things like that. And then, of course, there's also a huge historical interest. For example, we saw the Allied document said that 50 Germans had been killed, and that number is actually very incorrect. As usual, those sorts of numbers are always exaggerated. And we had no idea what the causes of death of the Germans were. We didn't know what unit they were from. We didn't know how old they were. We didn't know their ethnicity. And after the exhumation, now we know a whole bunch about them. We saw several of the causes of death. We saw what unit they're from. We saw that most of them were not even from Germany. They were from areas that are now in Poland or Czech Republic. And all that information was completely unknown before the grave was excavated. And all these bodies were reburied a few months after they were found by there's a German-French brigade in the army, and you can see here there's a French soldier and a German soldier, and all the bodies were reburied together, and this is the tombstone here that's above them. So for me, this was a really satisfying research, because it went on for years and years, and I tracked down all the families and found pictures of the soldiers and met the family members. It was really a unique experience in my life. So now that's the end of the video. I hope you found it interesting, and if you're trying to work on some kind of World War II research project, don't hesitate to send me an email. My email address is written here, and I'm always happy to hear from fellow researchers. Okay, so have a nice day. Bye bye.